Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. For all the returning listeners and subscribers, thank you for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you do dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a long way in promoting the channel. Just a brief reminder that if you dig the wide variety of programming that we provide here on TIR and you want to make sure we can stay on air, think about becoming a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber. When becoming a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber, you get access to champagne rooms and movie nights. So for as little as $3 a month or a one-time payment for $30 for the year, you get the satisfaction of knowing that your small donation goes a long way in keeping TIR on the air. Now, let's talk about why you guys are really here. Ultra leftism. That deserves a round of applause all to itself. Since President Trump signed what was touted as a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, bombs have continued to fall on Gaza. Hundreds of unexploded munitions remain scattered across the region, and famine-like conditions persist for millions of Palestinians. Yet, despite these horrors, global media attention has all but vanished. The story has been replaced by coverage of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, the Democratic Party's continued capitulation, and reports of ICE raids terrorizing immigrant communities under the banner of making America great again. For many who fought against U.S. support for Israel's apartheid regime, this moment feels painfully familiar. The cameras leave, the public outrage fades, and the suffering continues in silence. But amid that silence, we have to ask, how do we keep organizing for real justice and a true end to genocide when the spotlight moves on? In a recent piece published on his labor politics Substack titled Ultra Leftism Won't Help Free Palestine, union organizer and writer Eric Blanc interviews Palestinian organizers and unpacks some hard lessons for the U.S. left. His argument is clear. Moral outrage and online posturing aren't enough. A socialist movement must be rooted in working class organizing, not shaped by the rhetoric or performative politics of middle class activists. As Blanc writes, quote, "The idea that a socialist movement should take strategic cues from middle class activists, that's the problem. Why should that layer set the line for a class movement? There will always be segments of ethnic minorities who disagree with you, how you frame an issue. So what? We're socialists. Our aim is to organize the working class in all its complexity and ethnic makeup. That doesn't mean one constituency gets political primacy. To censor and shape what you say, how you articulate your struggle for working class power, and since every ethnic group or national group is heterogeneous and crisscrossed by competing class interests, there are always going to be real political differences within that group. If socialists end up being silenced by sectional interests as articulated by middle class activists, we're done," unquote. So today we'll ask, what kind of politics can actually build power against apartheid, imperialism, and genocide? Are we organizing to stop a genocide or just building personal brands of the suffering of others? Please welcome union organizer and writer Eric Blanc. Hey, Eric. Oh, you're muted. Oh,
Hey,
now
that
you're
was
fine.
me. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Since we agreed to do this show, you wrote another piece about the government shutdown and about where you think unions didn't do enough to keep pressure on the GOP. Can you explain that stance a little bit?
The sad reality, as people already know, is the Democratic Party is even worse than we thought, and the party capitulated to the Republicans in this long shutdown for basically nothing in exchange. The story that has been less understood is the extent to which unions either actively facilitated this capitulation or at a minimum didn't put up a real fight against it. So one of the really sad dynamics that we saw is that one of the largest, but in fact, the largest federal workers union, 2 weeks ago now, broke ranks and called on Democrats to essentially capitulate and just accept Trump's proposal to fund the government with no guarantees around anything, with no guarantees for continued healthcare funding through ACA subsidies and the other sort of basic demands that the Democrats and much of the labor movement was rightfully insisting that the Republicans pass as any basis for ending the shutdown. That union broke ranks, and the excuse, and there's some truth to it, is their members were not getting paid and people were hurting, and that's true. But that doesn't explain why they decided to pressure the Democrats to capitulate rather than the Republicans. That same anger and that same sort of material deprivation could and should have been channeled to fight the Republicans, especially since the Republican administration has been terrorizing federal workers. It's not like this is an administration that otherwise has been sort of on the side of workers. To the contrary, this is an authoritarian regime that has fired hundreds of thousands of workers. And so it was really politically suicidal, politically short-sighted, whatever adjective you want to use. It was horrible that the major federal union pushed on the Democrats to cave. And what we saw just a few days ago is that the big, one of the senators who flipped, one of the senators who'd been holding out, Tim Kaine of Virginia, essentially used the excuse of federal workers to explain why he flipped. He wrote, I think, a piece in the Times just now explaining this. And he said, well, I listened to my constituents, and after I capitulated, and use that word, he says, after I made the deal, I got a lot of criticism, but at least the union leaders thanked me, right? And so the way he articulated his move was that he had to do it on behalf of federal workers. And the stance of this union, AFG, to actively call to accept the Republicans' deal was a major force, certainly for Tim Kaine, but more broadly for kind of making it clear that the Republicans could have leverage and divide the movement against them. And then more broadly, the labor movement, even those who took the right stand, which is to say that it's time to fight. This is an authoritarian regime. It's a regime that is oriented towards actively starving millions of Americans by cutting off SNAP benefits. This is not a regime with whom you can play nice. You can hope for promises that they're going to do the right thing afterwards. This is a regime you have to fight. Now, a lot of unions said that, but they didn't actually fight themselves. For instance, there was no, as far as I could see, any public pressure on senators on the Democratic side to hold the line. There's press releases, I'm sure behind the scenes, they've met with some of these politicians, but when there's such pressure from the Republicans, you have to countervail that with organizing from below so that these waffling senators, of whom we've known have been trying to reach a deal like this for weeks now, you have to pressure them. You have to put their feet to the fire and say, no, working people are not going to accept you selling us out, and not in our name. And that didn't happen. The union movement, unfortunately, despite a lot of energy from below over the recent years, the leadership is extremely risk averse, extremely stuck in just the same old, making backroom deals with Democrats, and is not on a fighting footing. And part of the reason then you saw this horrific outcome in the shutdown was that the labor movement wasn't up to the task.
Do you think Trump's doging, like walking in the door in a way that he didn't do in 2016, is frightening for some union organizations? His ability to not really care about public perception, like you can't really use any old school political tactics against the guy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You would expect actually that given the degree of attacks, just unprecedented attacks against federal workers and unions, over 1 million union workers lost their right to collective bargaining because Trump just unilaterally overnight said, oh, we're not going to let federal workers have a union. Sorry, right? In the name of national security, very bizarrely. You would expect that given this degree of attack, that unions would start fighting back. But as you suggested, actually, what we've seen is almost a cowering approach, where the hope of many union leaders is somehow if we keep our heads down or we don't put up too hard of a fight, that maybe somehow we'll get through on the other side. And so that's an issue with unions across the board right now, and the thing that explains part of the reason there's not more of a fight back is that there's so much fear that fighting will bring the wrath of Trump down on you, that then it becomes a self-perpetuating dynamic where then then Trump is emboldened because people aren't fighting. And this is how authoritarian regimes survive and actually grow. It's not primarily through repression, it's by using fear so that powerful institutions bend the knee, the media, companies, unions. And so, yeah, the labor movement, I would say a lot of unions, have said the right things against Trump and opposed them. The federal unions have certainly opposed what Trump is doing to them, but there has not been a pivot to kind of a mass fight back strategy at all. It's been litigation at best.
How does that make you feel as someone that's in the middle of all this?
Oh, make me go crazy. I'm losing my mind. I mean, honestly, I was so just disgusted, shocked that when the union AFG, 2 weeks ago came out and basically said, okay, screw the rest of you. We understand, and I didn't say it in these words, but their actions meant it doesn't matter to us so much if millions of Americans are going to lose their healthcare coverage. What we're going to do is put our members first by making a deal or putting pressure to make a deal with Trump. And the crazy thing about it is that's not even, it would be bad enough if it was just a question of putting their members over the rest of the working class, but it's not even so good for their members because this is an authoritarian regime trying to destroy this union. This is an authoritarian regime already actively destroying this workforce. So this was a chance we had to actually win. That's the thing that makes me so enraged is, everyone has felt powerless. How do you stop Trump? How do you stop Trump? Finally, we had him on the ropes. Right? The flights were getting canceled, holidays were coming, anger. People were blaming the Republicans for the shutdown. You had all this leverage. All you had to do was hold out a bit longer, and you would have inflicted a huge political cost on Trump. The most likely outcome is that they would have resorted to a filibuster, which would have been a great win for our side. We should hate the filibuster. It's a minoritarian, minoritarian mechanism, and you would have forced the Trump regime to retreat. That didn't happen for no good reason. The Democrats were cheated, and the unions played a role in facilitating that.
How does that work, though, with a certain kind of solidarity that workers are fighting for, right? We constantly talk about low union density. Does this keep people in a certain position of, we talk about not trusting institutions, not trusting unions as well, feeling like they're kind of all working together to F them?
It's so tricky because on the one hand, a lot of unions say the right things and are doing the right things, even if not sufficiently. So I don't want to paint too broad of a brush. Their unions have mobilized to a certain extent their members for no kings. It's been way less than is needed for this moment. But for the most part, most unions are on the right side on this. The problem is that when the push comes to shove, particularly in these big fights, most union leaders, if forced to make a decision, a tough decision about, am I going to take the risk of building a solidarity struggle with the whole working class, or am I going to take the easier route of just trying to narrowly defend, or at least think I'm defending my own members? What ended up happening is that all of the talk about rhetoric around solidarity faded away. So yeah, it's a real concern when you have a federal union say, okay, I'm actually not so concerned if American workers lose their health care because we need to get back to work. Yeah, what that tells American people is oh, unions are not for me. Unions are for their own members, and what we need is a labor movement that speaks on behalf and fights for the whole working class. But that's not currently what we have. And it's really dispiriting. And I think that's not so surprising because the union leadership has been bad for a long time. And I don't think we should write off the labor movement. But the big conclusion from this is there's just no world in which you can rely on these leaders to start leading. This struggle is going to advance despite them, not because of them. And you can force them into doing the right things. And if you organize from below, then you can push them into the right direction. But it's not because they take the initiative. They've had more than enough time to take the initiative. We're a year into an authoritarian regime, and they've just missed the moment dramatically.
Has there been too much attention around the demonstrations and people assume that maybe unions are a little stronger than they are and don't look at leadership? We're talking the high levels of leadership as something that might be careerist. So there's a big Starbucks strike going on in the States right now. I think people, especially in this left world, see that and really get excited, but kind of ignore what we're talking about right now with union leadership and this kind of capitulation.
I mean, both things can be true. It's great and amazing that Starbucks Workers United is striking and fighting back against, one of the biggest corporations in the country and in the world. And I think it's really important for, all viewers and anybody on the left and in the labor movement to go all in to support them. Because if they win a first contract, which is what their strike is for, that's going to be a huge boost to help other workers who don't have a union have the confidence that if you fight back, even under a Republican regime, you can build a union and improve your workplace. And so the stakes of Starbucks is really high. And I would say it's going to be struggles like that point the way forward. Starbucks didn't come about because there was a national leadership decide, we're going to go organize Starbucks. It came through, a small group of radical salts who decided to go and salt, which means getting a job at a non-union workplace to unionize it in Buffalo. And they sparked this. And I think it's going to be that dynamic where workers organizing for that's going to be the energy that's going to show people that there is a fighting labor movement. So I'm not at all trying to write off the labor movement. I think that, workers are most powerful part of the progressive movement left because when we withhold our labor, no institutions can function. So there's just nobody else who has that potential leverage that we do. But it's going to require a lot of bottom-up initiative to move in the direction we want. And Starbucks Workers United is a really good example of that. There's plenty of other local unions who are fighting back. So on a local level, I do think things are a little better. There's local union leaders who are fighting back. But at least on a national level, they're missing the moment. So the initiative has to come from below.
Also, wherever you guys are watching or listening to this, there is a link in the description to Eric's Substack where he publishes these pieces, I would say on a weekly, bi-weekly basis?
Yeah, about a week, every other week, maybe sometimes.
Now, the article that we're here to talk about, can you summarize a little bit of the main argument, the ultra-leftism won't help free Palestine, and why you felt it was important to make that intervention right now? Because you did write the piece, I think, right before the quote-unquote ceasefire.
Yeah, it's just worth flagging that it was a interview. So it was an interview with Hoda and Bashir, two Palestine activists. And part of it was that I know the three of us had really felt not just devastated about the state of things in Gaza, although obviously I think that's the primary impulse. The reality is I've just been heartbroken every day for the last 2 years plus. I have a little kid, and just imagining what it's like, in Gaza and frankly in West Bank also these days, just the horrors. It hurt me in a way that I don't think anything had affected me before I had a kid. Somehow it just felt a lot more personal. I'm also I'm Jewish, and this being done in my name and our name made it, even more sort of just morally unacceptable. So obviously that is something that I think across the board anybody on the left shares. Certainly, I'm not the only person in the article.
You actually mentioned that, which I actually appreciated, that kind of personal aspect of, and I think that hits a lot of people that have been seeing this. I think that's why we've seen the tides turn so hard of people saying pro-Palestinian things, a relatively new phenomenon in the U.S.
100%. And so I do think that the impetus in that sense was just how do we make this stop? And that's certainly not, I'm not the only person, and Hoda and Bashir are not the only people who've had that feeling. I think we've all had that feeling. The question is, what do you do about it? And the main intervention of the article is to try to, push back against certain practices and assumptions and strategic orientations that we've seen as being counterproductive in the American Palestinian solidarity movement. And so, the focus of our article is to push back on what we consider ultra leftism in the movement, which we can go into specify, but essentially doing tactics and demands that make it harder for us to build the type of broad-based and deep movement necessary to actually force our government to cut off funds for Israel. So the question becomes, how do you build enough power to force those who run our government to cut off funds? And a lot of the answer on the left in the US has been unstrategic. It's been what you could describe as maybe like performative. It's about like affirming your position around what's happening in Israel and Palestine without being able to articulate that in a way and with demands that can resonate as widely as possible and that can bring as many ordinary people who aren't yet on the left into the struggle. And so we can get into the details of that. But yeah, we were pushing back against this kind of counterproductive tendency in the movement in the hope that we can build and need to build a more powerful movement. And I would say this goes to the first point you mentioned, that it's particularly urgent now to have a deep organized movement around Palestine because it's not in the news as much. And so the extent to which kind of pressure on the politicians is getting driven just by the headlines is going to be less in this new context. We need more organization than to be able to talk to our neighbors, to our coworkers, to our friends about what's going on. And it's precisely because we don't have that level of organization, in part because of ultra leftism, that we're in a really tough spot right now where when it's out of the spotlight, it's not going viral online. How do you keep up the pressure? And for that, you need an organized movement.
Did it scare you a little bit when the quote unquote ceasefire deal was signed, knowing that regardless of the situation on the ground, a lot of people would probably start focusing elsewhere? I mean, there's a lot of things going on at once in US politics with this current administration. The government shutdown, even Donald Trump had to admit that he feels it had a lot to do with the Democrats kind of sweeping these midterm elections. How did the ceasefire change your strategy in trying to talk about this? Because even in this small left media milieu, because there isn't a certain amount of funding from PBS or NPR, right? People chase the hot headline, and the hot headline is no longer Israel Palestine. It's government shutdowns and Democratic Party capitulation. So how does this situation kind of change your strategy to keep the focus on this anti-war movement, which ultimately where it sits, I think?
Yeah, we had started thinking about doing this interview even before there was serious moves towards a ceasefire, because we knew the anniversary of October 7th was coming up. And so we kind of started planning it out in relation to that. And I mean, the first thing I would say is that it's a really good thing that there was some degree of ceasefire. It's obviously it's not real in the sense that both parties have ceased to fire. Israel continues to kill Palestinians, but it is true that it's not as bad as before, and that's a win for them. It's like anything we can do to save millions of people from mass starvation and from death is a win. And so I think it is important to flag. It's contradictory. On the one hand, Israel is continuing to make moves, but it's not as bad as it was before. And in many ways, it's possible that we're going to go back to the situation prior to October 7th, in which Israel was routinely killing people, but it was not the mass scale starvation and death. And that's like a really low bar. I mean, it's horrible if you think about this, how low our expectations have gone, in which just like normal routine violence is seen as a win. But I do think if from the question of like preventing a genocide, it reflects some level of mass international outrage that at a certain point, there was enough pressure to at least force Israel to nominally come to the table. Again, the deeper issue, as you mentioned, though, is what do you do when, because of in the name of the ceasefire, and this is where I think it becomes dangerous, and you're right to flag, people stop paying attention. Well, this is actually often the case with movements that, it's not normally the case that when we're organizing, it's the headline. We normally have to organize despite it not being a topic focused on, in the news. And so that's why organizing exists. That's why you can't just rely on posting online and relying on outrage. You have to talk to your neighbors. You have to talk to your coworkers. If you're a student, you have to talk to others on campus, and you have to build those relationships. Unfortunately, so much of the left ecosystem is warped by the algorithm these days.
Yes.
And so it becomes so much of what happened around Palestine, frankly, was outrage, which is legitimate. But then it was almost as if people thought posting about the horrors was like doing their part to stop it, which I can understand that and I posted, and it's fine to post, but it became almost a substitute for the real organizing amongst talking people who don't already agree with us. And so then what happened is then when that kind of culture online in which saying the most radical things and being the most kind of hard line rhetorically, that does really well online, because of the algorithm, but it doesn't do so well when you're actually trying to convince people who aren't yet on board, right? And so that's what we saw a little bit, I think, with some of the encampments, is that kind of things that played online one way. Then when you try to go offline, it turns out that, talking about using rhetoric that is like really explosive and potentially like confusing, like globalized intifada. Like I don't even care. I'm Jewish. I know intifada means struggle, but as an organizer, I don't think it's anti-Semitic. I don't think being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. But also as an organizer, you don't want to use demands or rhetoric that give the other side more of an opportunity to smear you, that give the other side more of an opportunity to repress you. Everything you want to do is to frame your demands and your rhetoric in a way that's going to resonate beyond those who already agree with you. And I think what we saw is, it turns out when you're online, you don't realize, you feel like everyone already agrees with you because that's the way it goes. Everyone's retweeting. But the reality is so many Americans are sort of horrified maybe at what's going on in Israel. But they don't really know debates about Zionism or settler colonialism. And so you need to be able to speak to them in a language that resonates. And I think we have examples of what that could look like. I think Zoran Mamdani did a really good job of talking in a way that resonates. So he framed it not in terms of the activist left, but saying, I believe in equal rights. Right? How smart was that? Because it's a way to frame an opposition to the Zionist project without sort of assuming a level of jargon. You just say, I believe in equality for everyone. How could you oppose that? Who could oppose that? And that spirit of talking in a way that could resonate beyond activist circles, I think, was lacking, particularly in some of the more left-wing and student-based parts of the movement.
What would you define as ultra-leftism? Like the internet.
I mean, there's a lot of different forms it takes. I think on a basic level, ultra leftism means that you're putting forward demands and tactics that are too radical or too advanced for the current state of consciousness and movement of the masses, the majority of people. And so, it's very context specific, right? Like a demand that maybe would make sense in a revolutionary context, or maybe would make sense on the ground in the Middle East, might not make sense in the United States, where the level of consciousness and mobilization is a lot lower. So as organizers, what you're always trying to do is gauge where people are at, so you help them move the next step forward in their action, in their consciousness, in the struggle. And ultra-leftism tends to skip those steps and go 12 steps ahead. And then we feel good because we have the line, and we think that the masses are eventually going to come around if we just sort of yell it loudly enough. I think that's the underlying assumption of ultra-leftism, is that you basically just have to tell the truth as loudly as possible, criticize all those who prevaricate and who muddy the truth, and eventually the masses will follow. And I just don't actually think that's the way movements happen or how progress happens.
Does ultra-leftism feel to you like more of a modern day branding exercise, because everybody is, constantly selling themselves this brand something, where you have to promote yourself as the ultra-leftist, have the ultra-left perspective, and damn the people if they don't understand, and kind of disconnected from even any sort of real idea about what organizing and having a big tent program looks like? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Hold on, Eric. Something happened on my end where I can't.
I muted. I think ultra-leftism has always been an issue, particularly in the United States, but internationally as well. It's been exacerbated by social media, but it's a generalized phenomenon. And one of the tricky things is, when movements are weak, it's easier to be ultra-left because you don't have a mass base that you're responsible to, and that you can test whether your message is really catching. And so when you're really small, the consequences for being ultra left or low, and you can just blame it on people's backwardness, ideology. So there's an implicit blame game going on, that if people aren't yet coming around, it's because they're backwards or they're racist or whatever, and it's not I think part of moving away from ultra-leftism is having more confidence in the ability of ordinary people to change their minds, and then helping them go through that process. So ultra-leftism has always been a tendency in the international left. There's always been a tendency, particularly of more inexperienced and smaller, inexperienced activists and smaller organizations, to kind of go too far ahead. And one of the crucial things about developing and accumulating experience as an organizer is learning the art of organizing, in which you're always trying to push people forward, but you have to have like a really, really rigorous and sort of clear-headed sense of where people are actually at, and not just small groups of radicals that were around you, but where the millions are at. And so I do think that this is a fundamental difference between ultra-leftism and mass politics. Is everybody says they're for the masses, but if you're actually trying to do mass politics, you have to frame your demands in relation to where the millions are, not where the dozens are or the hundreds are. So that's kind of like a fundamental tension that's always existed. But what you mentioned is entirely right, is that this becomes sort of greatly exacerbated by online culture, because everybody has an incentive now for the algorithm to say more extreme things and to say things that will create more engagement. And also there's an echo chamber dynamic where you are getting feedback from people who already agree with you. And if you dunk on another person, you're getting feedback that reinforces this tendency to go kind of as far to the left as possible. And there's also just an built-in assumption amongst so many people that the way you make change in the world, and maybe they don't say this publicly, but it's de facto how people think when they're posting online, is, well, I'm doing my part. I'm saying what, I'm standing up against the horrors of the world. And it just actually dramatically overstates the importance of individuals as individuals just saying their piece online, like as if that's the thing that's going to really create the movement we need. And in the pre-social media days, there wasn't as many avenues for individuals to sort of just like pontificate. And that had the positive aspect of then, well, if you wanted to do politics, it meant talking to other people, like in person. And now you can sort of feel like you're doing your part, even if really it's just posting. It's just posting.
You write, it's written in the interview. I don't believe you say this yourself. It's the idea that a socialist movement should take strategic cues from middle-class activists. That's the problem. How does this dynamic play out in today's Palestine solidarity movement?
Yeah, I believe that quote is from Bashir, and I agree with it. But I think this is where it becomes tricky, is that today and throughout history, it's often been the case that student activists are further ahead of the rest of the population. And so then there can be a danger of assuming that the norms of the student activists and that are sort of surrounding you are actually shared by the broader population. And so this becomes a real issue in the recent student movement, because the operating assumption was that kind of the masses were where the student activists were at, and that the way people have talked about these the encampments and the occupations had a real tendency to obfuscate the extent to which really we're talking about thousands of people participated in the occupations, and the encampments, which is great. That's good. I'm glad people took action, but we're not talking about millions. And so then the difficulty becomes when you assume that these student activists are speaking for the millions. And part of the reason people assume that's to be the case is that on the US left, and maybe also elsewhere, there's an assumption of like political homogeneity amongst communities of color, which is actually sort of, I think, almost like a flip side of racism, right? Where you think everyone in another group is the same. And I'm not saying these people are racist. That's not my point. I'm just saying that actually this tacit assumption that like all Palestinian Americans or all Palestinians believe the same thing is just so far from the truth that it lends itself to all sorts of bizarre political things, like we can't criticize Hamas, right? Like you can't criticize Hamas because if you're standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people, that's the leadership of the Palestinian movement. And so, it would sort of be not being a good ally to criticize, and if you support self-determination, you're not criticized. The problem is, if we're trying to build a movement in the United States, it is important, I think, to like distance ourselves from targeting civilians, because just on a moral and political basis, I think that's correct. And then B, like the main smear campaign against our side, as everybody knows, is that we're supporting terrorism. So it's important to do Zoran did, and just say, no, I'm not in favor of, you can denounce targeting civilians. It doesn't mean you're tacitly supporting the Israeli government. It just means that you're clarifying to the public that when we say we oppose genocide, when we say we're opposing Zionism, we're not saying go kill all the Jews, and it's correct to say that. Mm-hmm. And to go just on the basic question you flagged, the difficulty becomes is if you assume that any sort of spokesperson for a community, whether it's workers or communities of color, sort of is speaking on behalf of that whole community, you really are underestimating the extent to which every community has huge political debates. This is certainly the case in Arab Americans, Palestinian. There's huge debates on the ground in the US, and you just can't assume that there's political agreement. And so it's not just, there's not a basis for then us saying, if we're not of that group, well, we need to take our lead from XYZ activists, because every movement has its debates, and you need to take a stance that you think is correct for building a movement, not because you're just deferring to another group.
I think the Zoran thing that you bring up is kind of important. That people forget that it was just a year ago Jamal Bowman lost a seat because he opposed Israel and AIPAC, and just a year later in the same city, Zoran Mandami wins a decisive victory in New York. Same rhetoric. What's the difference?
It's a great question. Well, the most obvious difference is that public opinion has shifted dramatically against Israel because of its genocide. The stats are basically undisputable at this point. If you just look at, particularly amongst Democratic voters, but also now, amongst Republicans more recently, but it's just completely flipped. You had prior really to October 7th and the subsequent genocide, most people tended to give their support to Israel, and that's gone now because people saw live streamed what that government was doing. And so just the overall political terrain has shifted. I think also that, one of the things Zoran did correctly, and I'm not even sure this was different than Bowman, but part of what Zoran did right on this is that he made it really clear that he was running on an affordability agenda. And so the people who kept on bringing up Palestine in relation to Zoran were always the right wing and the Democratic Party establishment to smear him. So he had to respond, and he responded well. But in part because he centered his fight and he shifted the terrain to be around affordability, it made it, I think, his movement get more success. And part of what Bowman had a harder time doing was just getting that level of mass buy-in around his own agenda. Because when you do that, when you have the momentum, when it looks like you're going to win, and when you can win, it actually creates a little bit more space for you to be able to not get sunk by AIPAC and by your stance on Palestine. So you need to be able to do both. Just having a good stance on Palestine is not going to be enough to win an election. Even today, if Zoran had only been good on Palestine, he would have lost. And so that goes again to the kind of tactical, strategic questions, how you build a mass movement. It's not always just the case that you shout as loudly as possible all of your positions and hope people come around. If Zoran had did that, he would have gotten 2%.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he started off as kind of a fringe candidate. How do you go from fringe candidate to the mayor of New York?
Well, to use his terminology, it's just he was relentlessly focused on an affordability agenda, which is true. He's just basically he understood that the number one issue in America and in New York City is that people are struggling to survive, and that you have to speak to that sort of material insecurity and anxiety, and that he understood, unlike so many Democratic centrists, that's not the case that Trump's re-election sort of shifted a dramatic move of Americans to the right. And he went and talked to, working class New Yorkers, mostly Black and brown folks, about why they voted for Trump. And this was maybe his first video that ever went viral. And it turns out, that it was mostly for cost of living reasons. And he understood that if you could speak to people's real struggles daily on that, and you could propose a solution, right? That was not pie in the sky, but you could propose, how we could make your life better if the government functioned on behalf of people instead of billionaires. That message resonated. and he built a mass movement around it. I don't think it was just him as a candidate. There's no world in which Zoran wins if he didn't have Democratic Socialist America New York City chapter behind him, if he didn't build a volunteer army of 100,000 volunteers. That's crazy, 100,000. I don't think there's ever been per capita a bigger, or deeper campaign infrastructure. Like where else can you even think of something that scale? So many people. And so because people understood that he was for real, they poured their energy. And it was beautiful being in the city, over these last months, because you could just, if you wore a Zoran hat or pin or whatever, like every 2 minutes you get a high five or like a thumbs up. It's just like, that was the vibe in the city, because people are hungry for something new. And I think that Zoran provided that.
You've long emphasized the importance of class-based approach to organizing. How does class analysis reshape our understanding of the fight for Palestinian liberation?
Yeah, it's a really good and tough question. I think part of it has to do with a little bit what we were talking about before. It's distinguishing more clearly between what might resonate amongst campus activists and what might resonate more widely, and to not assume that campus activists are speaking on behalf of the broader people. And so we can just see that numerically, just to give an example. The actually biggest actions taken on behalf of Palestinian struggle, my sense of it, and people could double check this, is the uncommitted movement. So many people participated in the uncommitted movement. I think over 900,000 did voting uncommitted. And this was really deep amongst Arab American populations, but then also just with people who were horrified at the genocide. And so when you're thinking about what kind of message can resonate widely and not just amongst activists, when you're thinking, essentially, this goes to the class question: how do you get ordinary working class people who aren't tuned in yet, or not to the same extent, and aren't part of our movement? How do you get them to get involved, to express their anger, and how do you speak to them in a way that resonates? And I think what you saw with the uncommitted movement is a really amazing example of how you could do mass politics around Gaza and Palestine in a way that resonated with working class people, including Arab Americans, because we shouldn't assume that like all Arab Americans are already sort of ready to go to the barricades, to support Palestinian struggle. A lot of them voted for Trump. A lot of them don't like Hamas. A lot of them, their main issue is cost of living in the U.S. There's all of these mitigating factors that mean that you have to have a really grounded approach when you think about tactics. And the uncommitted did that because it framed a demand in a way that was really widely understood. Like, we're going to only vote for you if you take just really basic actions, right? What was it? Let a speaker, a Palestinian American, speak at the DNC.
Yeah.
Like, so basic. And so this is a really smart thing that if you're a good organizer, you do, is you want to find things that seem eminently reasonable to ordinary people, and you push on those, because you don't hit your enemy at where they're strongest, you hit them where they're weakest. And oftentimes it's going to be these immediate asks that seem reasonable to a lot of people. And then it turns out the Democratic Party establishment was so committed to its alliance with the Zionist state that they wouldn't even let a Palestinian American speak. Like, how crazy is that? It's insane. Even on their own grounds, like even on their purely pragmatic electoral grounds, like it didn't make any sense. But it showed and exposed, I think, far more than many of the smaller, more radical approaches. It showed a lot of people at the extent to which the Democratic Party is, at least its leadership is just complicit and tied to these horrors. And you do that. And this is, I think, it's just a good example of the counter example to ultra-leftism is you don't just tell people, you do have to tell people. We have podcasts, we write, all these articles, but you have to help people through their own experience and through their own participation come to these conclusions. That's how, the mass is generally learned. It's not just through like one by one propaganda we convince them. It's through experience in life and through participation in movements, even if those are, around relatively modest asks. So that comes back to the class question, because if you're trying to get the masses in motion, it might be around immediate issues at first. And so we can talk a little bit more about what that would mean for unions and leverage and how you would stop it. But as a top sort of line example, I would really point to uncommitted for more of a sort of class-based approach to around Palestine.
And you did point to uncommitted, and we did a few shows with some of the organizers in different parts of the country on the uncommitted movement. And I myself Maybe I'm a skeptic, but that's, I guess, part of my quote unquote job. I'm skeptical of everything. But I was actually quite pleased to see that it got so large that the Democratic Party establishment had to mention its name. They tried so hard to ignore it, and they couldn't anymore. So I guess that's a win. But kind of back to the media economy, how have things like Substacks and podcasts and social media activism changed how people engage with Palestine solidarity? And has it made organizing more performative in some aspects? And does that make your job harder?
Yeah. Such a good question. I think one of the negative parts of social media is that it exacerbates tendencies to atomization and towards individualism. And because think about it, in the past, if you wanted to kind of speak to people about left-wing issues, you almost by necessity had to do that via an organization, or at least through getting funding for something like a newspaper and having some sort of collective. And now the ability to, as an individual, have a Substack or to have like a high profile Twitter account or Instagram, whatever your thing is, it means that you can do politics, or at least think you're doing politics, just as an individual. And that is really just new. There's no, as far as I can think of, equivalence to that in the pre-internet era. And the dynamic then becomes that you have a lot of people who speak to a certain audience and are incentivized to speak in a way that is going to maximize their hits. And nuance, and this is, I'm not saying anything new here, nuance and sort of grounded takes is not what sells, right? And so it becomes tricky because your own material existence becomes dependent on the algorithm. Like literally, your survival depends not on like going out and talking to people who disagree with you. Your survival depends on getting the content that's most likely to track online, and the algorithm incentivizes the most extreme things. So that's going to pull you in that direction, and it makes it really hard. And one of the interesting things we saw, just to give an example of this, is that, you know, so much of the like internet culture, for whatever reason, became kind of pro-Trump in the lead up to 2024. You know, like the norm was like, Trump is kind of cool. He's like a little edgy. And what you saw is a lot of influencers and a lot of people who should have been better kind of like becoming soft on Trump because their own base and the rhythms of the internet culture pulled them in that direction. And so it's harder in some ways to take a principled stand when your own material sort of existence, because you depend on it for money, is predicated on the rhythms of the algorithm. And so I do think that it's new, and it lends itself to ultra-leftism for the same reason, because you're not based necessarily in an organization. You're not based on an organization that is going out and has to recruit ordinary people. You just have to kind of like stay relevant. And the way you stay relevant is by being really loud and really sort of in people's face. And that might do well online, but it's not necessarily the way that you make effective organizing change offline.
So it does make your job harder. Just a little bit.
I mean, I don't know. Does it make my job harder? Yeah. On the other hand, like, yes, it makes my job harder. On the other hand, it's good, you know, and this is sort of the counter argument would be, at least social media exists. It was able to expose some of the horrors, and you know, and so I do think that is not nothing. Right, because the mass media, I don't think the mass media, you know, would have exposed what's going on. So there's the flip side is you're able, and this is why people are still online. So you are able to sometimes break through the sort of corporate media's enforcement of like very pro-Israel lines. So I think that, you know, you could say that was positive, but the problem is turning that anger into organization. Yeah, it's harder these days.
What would a truly internationalist working class approach to Palestinian liberation look like in practice? How can labor unions, tenants groups, and other mass organizations play a role in sustaining pressure against apartheid and U.S. complicity?
I think I got a lot of inspiration from, and I think we have a lot to learn from the Italian labor movement, which has had two general strikes now around Gaza. And it shows that it's possible. It shows that working people aren't only committed to their immediate benefits, but that you can get to a point where unions, especially when there's a left leadership, are able to use the power that we have as a labor movement to halt production, to fight in solidarity with people across the world. And so we saw that it was very central in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s. Unions played a really big role in putting pressure on to end the apartheid regime and to boycott. And I think that if we are successful, and we need to be in sort of scaling up BDS activities to essentially put increased pressure on the Israeli government to end its occupation and to put pressure to stop the killings that are continue happening, then you are going to need unions really stepping up for that. And then so the question then becomes, how do you move the labor movement in that direction? And this is, again, the ultra leftism piece comes in here, because if your first time you go to a union meeting is you're like calling on the union to pass a resolution denouncing the Zionist entity or whatever, like, people are not going to know what you're talking about. They're like, who are you? Like, where were you last time we were fighting for a better contract? So part of the difficulty is that as the left, we just need to be stronger in the labor movement generally. And it might not be the mechanism to get that might not necessarily be because we're right on Palestine. It might be because we're able to be the most effective union as possible, and we are able to gain our workers' sort of respect and confidence. That gives us space to then talk about issues that might seem not immediately relevant to the workplace, right? Because it's not obvious. It's not obvious why unions should take a stance. We can walk people through, but it takes, there's a couple steps there you have to walk people through. So the big task, I think, as far as moving this direction of a more internationalist labor movement is, how do we build the left in organized labor generally, right? That includes Palestine, but that's not necessarily the main thing. It's like right now in labor, how are we fighting back against the billionaires that are destroying the livelihoods of Americans? How are we stopping authoritarianism? And I think it's in that process of rebuilding a left leadership in the union movement, because frankly, that's the only leadership that's going to be able to fight and win around the big picture issues in the US that are immediately affecting working people. Insofar as we're able to build that kind of left leadership in the union, that's going to give us space, and we have to speak out around Palestine in a way that will resonate, in a way that we can. There's a lot of leverage, not just striking, but unions, think about all of the pensions we have, and all of unions are big organizations with a lot of money. It's insane that so many unions, including progressive unions, still haven't fully divested stocks and their pensions from Israel or from Israel-connected activities. So there's all of these things we can do, but you need to be very deliberate about you do it, and you can't just sort of give a ultimatum to workers and say, if you're not with us, you're against us. That's not the way it works.
How do we maintain political clarity, opposing Israel's crimes and U.S. imperialism without falling into certain sectarian traps or purity politics?
Yeah. This is why it's really tricky, because ultra-leftism is always context specific.
Yes.
And I just think organizing as a whole, at least if you're a left organizer, you're always kind of straddling two potential errors you can make. One is being too accommodationist, right? Too willing to kind of just blend into what people currently think, too interested in just kind of going along with what the Democrat establishment says. And there's a lot of history in the US of progressivism and liberalism and leftism sort of making that error, in which the left doesn't provide a real alternative, and it becomes indistinguishable from the establishment that sort of we wanted to oppose. So you have that danger on the one side, and that's real. Think about any politician that you can imagine who gets elected on a left program and then does the opposite. So that is a classic example. And I don't really want to underestimate the extent to which that is an issue. And in some ways, that process feeds ultra-leftism, because people see that, right? They see the Democrats get elected every time, say they're going to do progressive things, and do the opposite, right? Over and over and over again. And so then people kind of bend the stick too far in the other direction, and they say, we should never work within the Democratic Party. That's XYZ, all of the sort of ultra left mistakes. I think then the crucial thing is to be aware of where working people and the masses are at, and to have a very rigorous and frankly like a level of curiosity and sort of open-endedness about where people actually are. And this is where it becomes hard, is that people's opinions are in flux too, right? It's not that people's opinions are static. And so we shouldn't be like the Democratic Party establishment that just looks at what polls best and say, okay, we're going to find like the median voter based on the polls, right? You can shift people's opinions. So Zoran showed, for instance, that you can make your issues the number one issue if you go out and agitate. But sometimes the ultra-left take would be, you can do that on any issue. They're like, look what Zoran did. He was able to shift the terrain. Like, we could do that on any issue in any way, right? So we just go out and talk about socialist revolution and, you know, like down with settler colonialism. And if we make that, we can move anybody in our direction. And the art of organizing is finding that middle ground where you understand where people are, you understand you can move them, things are in flux, but you need to be able to push on and concentrate on the types of demands and tactics and organizations that can move people from where to where we need them to be, and to look at that as a process and to not sort of skip 5 steps ahead. And I don't think there's a formula for that. And this is why some of these debates are hard, because what I might think is ultra left and other people will say is just right on the money. Or liberals, you know, the Democratic establishment thinks we're all ultra left. You know, they think everybody, all the Bernie people, you're always scaring people about talking about socialism. You know, so it's all a little bit context specific. And it's tricky. There's no formula for it. This is the major takeaway I've gotten from years of organizing, is if you think there's a formula for how to do this, that in itself is just starting point is wrong. Your starting point is wrong. There are no formulas. You constantly have to revisit your sort of assumptions, and you constantly have to learn from experience to see where people actually are at.
His name is Eric Blanc. What are you working on next?
Well, hopefully we can stop authoritarianism from consolidating itself in the United States. That's basically all I'm thinking about these days. I'm obsessed with how we can get workers and large numbers of workers to scale up to stop Trumpism. And I think that there's space for that. And I'm trying to talk through and write about and organize around how do we actually stop Trumpism.
Do you think there's hope that there can be, because, you know, a lot of these agreements that were made for the government shutdown are extremely temporary. Do you think there's hope that we can put pressure on Democrats and actually extend the ACA subsidies for longer periods of time? Or actually, is this the moment that Medicare for all comes into focus a little clearer than it did 8 years ago?
I don't think Medicare for all is the immediate thing, because if we can't even win around, winning the continuation of the subsidies, I mean, we need to fight for Medicare for all. So this becomes tricky again, to be specific. Like, we can always say what we think the solution is, right? I mean, like our long-term goals, there's like short-term and long-term. In the short-term, we need to have a really hard fight to pressure Republicans to not throw millions of Americans basically into an extremely dangerous situation where they don't have healthcare because they can't afford it. So we need to have a really hard fight about that. Will we be able to shift them enough? I don't know. When you go into a fight, you never know for sure if you're going to win. But if you put up a big enough a fight, it is always a win to a certain extent, because you can inflict a political cost on your opponent, even if you don't win the policy change, right? So if we have millions of Americans demanding that healthcare be saved, if the Republicans do it, then we call it a win because we've saved people's life, and then people feel empowered. And if they don't do it, then people see, like, despite our pressure, they are siding with the ultra rich, and that puts pressure on, frankly, the Republicans, that makes them more likely to just get completely obliterated in the next election. So I think that's, I don't know what will happen. I really have no idea. On the ACA, it could go either way. My guess is the Republicans are going to fold. I think the Republicans they're going to fold towards the billionaires. I don't think they're going to do the right thing. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to stop them.
Well, thank you very much. Wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show, there's a link in the description to read Eric's article and all of his articles, because the link is to his Substack. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, and have a very good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and appreciate all your work.
All right, Bay Area love. Peace out. Eric Blanc. It's from the Bay. All right, and I'll see you guys Saturday. I'll be back with Ralph Leonard, and we'll be talking about a movie that I haven't seen yet, so I have to watch that movie before we talk about it. Thank you guys very much, and we are